Good day once again from the International Space Station Flight Control Room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, where at this hour the Orbit 3 team of flight controllers is on duty, having recently completed a shift handover from the Orbit 2 team that presided over the International Space Station crew activities earlier today through mid-afternoon. The flight control team here at this hour, led by Flight Director Mike Serafin, will be on console for the next several hours. Serafin accompanied on console today on the left of your screen by astronaut Kate Rubins, who is the spacecraft communicator who will be talking to the space station crew throughout the course of the rest of the crew workday. This flight control team is working in concert with the Russian flight control team half a world away at the Russian Mission Control Center in Korolyov, Russia. You're looking at a live view from a camera overlooking the large flight control room there in the ISS flight control room outside of Moscow, where the Russian flight controllers will be in charge tonight of all of the activities associated with bringing home the 3 members of the Expedition 34 crew after almost 5 months in space. That Expedition 34 crew, led by the former Expedition 34 commander Kevin Ford, the flight engineer and tonight's Soyuz commander Oleg Novitsky, and flight engineer Yevgeny Tarelkin, have already been inside their Soyuz TMA-06M spacecraft, activating systems, checking out the atmospheric purification system on board the Soyuz spacecraft, and conducting communications checks with both ground sites across Europe and Asia that will be employed to track the Soyuz spacecraft after it undocks from the International Space Station during its descent back into the Earth's atmosphere and a landing on the steppe of Kazakhstan later tonight. Countdown clocks here in the Mission Control Center are ticking backward toward the undocking of the Soyuz spacecraft from the Poisk module that resides on the space-facing port of the Zvezda service module, undocking scheduled just under 3 hours and 41 minutes from now at 6:43 p.m. Central Time. And as the saying goes, what a difference a day makes. Yesterday at this time we were watching extremely poor weather across Kazakhstan that prevented the landing of the Expedition 34 crew, delaying it 24 hours as fog and freezing rain descended over the steppe of Kazakhstan, preventing the deployment of Russian Mi-8 helicopters to the landing site to forward landing staging areas. That fog and freezing rain, the product of a series of low-pressure systems and cold fronts that swept across the Kazakh steppe and persistently hung on over the course of the past few days to prevent the Russian search and recovery force helicopters from leaving the staging city of Kustanay, Kazakhstan, for forward staging points in the towns of Arkelik, Kazakhstan, and Aktobe, far to the west. The difference is, once that cold front moved through in the wee hours this morning, it brought colder temperatures, but clear skies. Those clear skies remain at this hour, and everything weather-wise is in great shape for the return of Ford, Novitsky, and Tarelkin several hours from now. In the wee hours this morning, 8 out of the 12 prime helicopters deployed from Kustanay, Kazakhstan, just across the Russian border, to Arkelik and Aktobe. They have been in place throughout the course of the day. 4 additional helicopters will fly from Kustanay directly to the landing site to the northeast of Arkelik in time for the touchdown of the Soyuz TMA-06M, with landing scheduled at 10:05 and 41 seconds p.m. Central Time tonight. Here is a timeline of the Soyuz landing activities as they will unfold over the course of the next several hours. Again, undocking of the spacecraft from the Poisk module, scheduled at 6:43 p.m. Central Time. The Soyuz will conduct a separation burn to begin an opening rate away from the International Space Station, where it will wind up a distance of several hundred kilometers away from the station for the firing of the Soyuz engines, a deorbit burn of 4 minutes and 44 seconds. The burn, you're seeing an animation of the departure of the Soyuz craft from the Poisk module. The deorbit burn scheduled to begin at 9:13 and 4 seconds Central Time. a retrograde maneuver of 128 meters per second to slow the Soyuz down and enable it to drop out of orbit for its high-speed descent back into the Earth's atmosphere. Again, once the burn is complete, the Soyuz will head for a separation of the three sections of the Soyuz spacecraft. The only section that survives is the one that the crew is in. That is called the descent module. The crew will be strapped into its seats. Will begin entry into the Earth's atmosphere at 9:42 p.m. Central Time, after which a series of parachute deployments will commence. The command to open the parachute scheduled at 9:51 p.m. Central Time. That will result in the Soyuz aiming for its target northeast of Arkelik. The parachute deployment first with a pilot parachute, then a larger drogue chute. Finally, the main chute will deploy. Braking rockets will fire just a few seconds away from touchdown, with landing scheduled at 10:05 p.m. Central Time tonight, which will be 9:05 a.m. on Saturday morning in Kazakhstan, 1 hour 23 minutes after sunrise. The weather forecast for landing, according to the Spaceflight Meteorology Group here at the Johnson Space Center, is expected to be ideal. Just a few clouds at 2,000 feet, a broken ceiling of clouds at 25,000 feet, almost unlimited visibility, very light winds. The temperature, again, in the wake of the passage of that cold front and the low pressure system overnight, will result in extremely cold temperatures, about 18 degrees Fahrenheit at landing time. Temperatures will be rising into the mid-20s during the course of the extraction of the crew in the hour or so that will follow. The crew will be brought out of the Soyuz, placed on reclining chairs, covered with heavy blankets, to enable themselves to acclimate to a gravity environment for the first time in 144 days since their launch from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan last October 23rd. The wind chill factor is expected to be just a few degrees above 0 Fahrenheit for that post-landing time frame. But again, the key here is that the visibility was perfect overnight in Kazakhstan, enabling about two-thirds of the search and recovery forces helicopters to fly from Kustanai down to their staging areas in Arkelik and Aktobe. Aktobe is far to the west of the landing site, in position for a ballistic entry should that be necessary in the event, the highly unlikely event, of a Soyuz systems problem at the time of entry prior to touchdown that would leave the Soyuz falling far short of its nominal landing target. At this hour, the International Space Station is flying 254 statute miles above the southern Indian Ocean, moving from southwest to northeast in an orbit inclined 51.6 degrees to either side of the equator. The next step in the process will be farewells between the crew members and the closing of the hatches. That is expected around 3:25 p.m. Central Time today. We are not expected to have live coverage of the hatch closure due to the fact that we will be out of range of our tracking and data relay satellite communications system. The crew is expected to record all of that activity on board. We will be replaying it during the second of our broadcasts this evening prior to undocking, the second broadcast to get underway at 6:15 p.m. Central Time tonight. The crew will be strapping themselves into their respective seats in the descent module of the Soyuz spacecraft, with Oleg Novitsky, the Soyuz commander, in the center seat, Kevin Ford in the right seat of the Soyuz, the board engineer for tonight's entry and landing as he was for launch 5 months ago. Yevgeny Turelkin, he'll be seated in the left seat of the descent module. That is the centermost section of the three-section Soyuz spacecraft. Up top, the orbital module. The bottom section is the instrumentation and propulsion or service module that carries the propellant tanks and the engines that will burn for 4 minutes and 44 seconds, the deorbit burn at 9:13 p.m. Central Time tonight to begin the journey home for Ford, Turelkin, and Novitsky. You will be hearing Russian flight controllers refer to the crew in the Soyuz vehicle under the call sign of Kazbek. That is the name chosen by Novitsky, the Soyuz commander, after one of the major mountains of the Caucasus, the mountain range located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Ford, Novitsky, and Turelkin at the time of landing will have spent 144 days in space since their launch back on October 23rd and 142 days on the orbital laboratory. Ford, in total, will have logged 158 days in space on his two flights, having accrued 14 days as the pilot of the shuttle Discovery on the STS-128 mission back in August and September of 2009. Novitsky and Turelkin, of course, will have recorded 144 days in space each on this, their first flight. The three crew members at the time of landing will have orbited the Earth 2,304 times, logging almost 61 million miles of travel. Once Ford, Novitsky, and Turelkin undock their Soyuz TMA-06M spacecraft from the Poisk module of the International Space Station 3.5 hours from now, the formal start to Expedition 35 will be marked. The way the International Space Station program logs increments is from undocking to undocking. So left behind aboard the station, the new Expedition 35 commander, Chris Hadfield of the Canadian Space Agency, on the right-hand side of your screen in this crew portrait. In the middle, Russian cosmonaut Roman Romanenko, and on the left, NASA flight engineer Tom Marshburn. Hadfield, just a few hours ago, in fact, conducted an in-flight event with Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper and students who were gathered at the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. Hadfield, Romanenko, and Marshburn will tend to station systems and activities over the course of the next 2 weeks before the launch of the next crew on the Soyuz TMA-08M spacecraft. That will be commanded by veteran cosmonaut Pavel Vinogradov in the center of your screen, joined by flight engineer Alexander Mazurkin on the right, and NASA flight engineer Chris Cassidy on your left. Those three crew members are scheduled for launch on the afternoon of March 28th U.S. time in the pre-dawn hours of March 29th from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan for an expedited 6-hour 4-orbit journey to the International Space Station, the first single-day launch-to-docking operation for an International Space Station crew. That expedited transit from launch pad at Baikonur to the station has been validated through the 3 previous unmanned Progress resupply vehicles, and now it's time to exercise that activity for a Soyuz crew. The Expedition 35-36 crew, as they are called, flying in the Soyuz TMA-08M spacecraft, again scheduled for launch out of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and will be providing live coverage at the times you see on your screen 2 weeks from now when it's their turn to fly. That trio is scheduled for launch again on the afternoon of March 28th U.S. time, the early morning hours of March 29th Baikonur time. They are finishing up administrative work and a week of relaxation at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, Russia. They are scheduled to fly down to their launch site at the Baikonur Cosmodrome tomorrow to begin their final 2 weeks of training. As we await confirmation of the closing of the hatches between the Poisk module and the Russian segment of the International Space Station, the first step in the journey home for Ford, Novitsky, and Tarelkin, once those hatches are closed, there will be a period of leak checks on both sides of the docking interface to ensure that we have a tight seal between the Soyuz and the International Space Station prior to the depressurization of the small passageway or vestibule that links the forward end of the Soyuz spacecraft to the Poisk module itself. Everything is expected to go as planned with those leak checks. Once the hatches are closed and the leak checks get underway, the Soyuz will be transferred to internal battery power, autonomous power as it is known, and at that point Novitsky will be deactivating the Soyuz electrical connections to the International Space Station that has provided power for the Soyuz spacecraft since its docking back on October 25th. Soyuz systems, including the motion control system and its thrusters, have been thoroughly checked out over the past week or so, and the Soyuz is in excellent shape for its re-entry back into Earth and a landing on the steppe of Kazakhstan. Again, the landing scheduled just a few seconds after 10:05 p.m. Central Time tonight, 9:05 a.m. Kazakhstan time on Saturday morning, an hour and 23 minutes after sunrise.
Moscow МКС.
Control Moscow, ISS of space to ground 2.
На связи ВСГ-2.
Go ahead, space to ground 2.
На связи ВСГ-2. Окей, выполнили съемку.
We are done with
Монтаж. Быстросъемок.
video taping of clamps removal.
Вот, нашли по времени. Приступим.
And per scheduled time, we will start closing the hatch. Yes, let's have the same arrangement, approximately the time that is scheduled, but on our go. Please talk to us before you start closing the hatch.
Alex, ну я вот получил одно подтверждение.
I received one more confirmation.
Мы можем приступать к закрытию.
We can start closing the hatch at the scheduled time. Okay, copy. Oh, there was a short LOS, but I understand.
Russian flight controllers at the Russian Mission Control Center in Korolyov outside Moscow providing the reminder and choreography of how the hatch closure will take place. Just a reminder for Oleg Novitsky to wait for the go from Russian flight controllers there in Korolyov before he begins that procedure. Once the hatches are closed on both sides of the docking interface between the Soyuz spacecraft and the Poisk module, Novitsky on the Soyuz side of the hatch and Roman Romanenko on the station side of the docking interface will begin a process of leak checks to ensure that we have a tight seal between the Soyuz and the station for the eventual undocking 3 hours, 24 minutes from now. Rewinding 24 hours, yesterday, once again, the weather was horrible, as was discussed by the chief flight director for the Russian side, Vladimir Solovyev, with the crew yesterday, as he indicated that we were waving off a landing attempt for last night due to fog and freezing rain that prevented the Russian search and recovery helicopters from deploying from Kustanay, Kazakhstan, down to Arkalyk and the ballistic staging site far to the west at Aktobe. The weather was simply unacceptable. A Russian state commission met yesterday afternoon U.S. time and waved off the landing. That was relayed up to the crew, providing a bonus day in space for Ford, Novitsky, and Tarelkin. But as we mentioned earlier, the low-pressure system and cold fronts that have lingered across the steppe of Kazakhstan and most of southern and eastern Europe, as well as western Asia, have now passed well to the east of Kazakhstan, yielding clear skies and colder temperatures that will greet the three crew members after the hatches are open and they are extracted from their Soyuz spacecraft on the ground at the landing site just to the northeast of Arkalyk. The intended target landing site for the three crew members is actually 36 miles northeast of Arkalyk. The intended landing coordinates are 50.39 degrees north latitude, 67.20 degrees east longitude, the landing occurring about 1 hour, 23 minutes after sunrise, with temperatures expected to be in the mid-teens at landing time to greet, that's Fahrenheit, to greet the three crew members once they are extracted from the spacecraft. They will be placed in reclining chairs on the surface of the steppe of Kazakhstan to permit an opportunity for a few minutes for them to acclimate themselves to a gravity environment after almost 5 months of weightlessness. They then will be lifted in those reclining chairs and brought into a nearby inflatable medical tent that will be erected by Rosaviatsia and RSC Energia personnel on scene. The crew will have an opportunity to get out of those heavy Sokol launch and entry suits that they will wear during their descent back to Earth and get into more comfortable flight clothing. After about an hour in the medical tent or so, they will be brought into individual helicopters for a 2-hour flight from the landing site northeast of Arkalyk back to the staging city of Kustanay, Kazakhstan. At that point, Kevin Ford will board a NASA plane that is on the ground in Kustanay for the flight back to Houston, while Novitsky and Tarelkin board a Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center aircraft for the flight back to Chkalovsky Airfield outside of Star City, Russia, and a reunion with Russian space officials and their families. For the remaining crew members on board the station, who again formally begin Expedition 35 at the time of the Soyuz undocking this afternoon and this evening, Chris Hadfield, the new station commander who took over command of the station in a change of command ceremony on Wednesday, and Roman Romanenko and Tom Marshburn, they will essentially relax this weekend and have a chance to catch their breath. It's been a very hectic pace of activity on board the station. They'll press right back into a bevy of scientific research work early next week, and will gear up for the departure of the SpaceX Dragon cargo craft on Monday, March 25th. Tom Marshburn will be at the controls at the robotic workstation in the cupola for the grapple, unberthing, and release of the Dragon spacecraft on Monday, March 25th. The Dragon will drift away from the International Space Station for its deorbit and re-entry back to Earth, and a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean about 460 nautical miles west of Baja, California. NASA television will provide coverage of the departure of Dragon through the time it leaves the keep-out zone around the International Space Station. That coverage on Monday, March 25th will begin at 4 a.m. Central Time, 5 a.m. Eastern Time. Once again, we are out of range of our tracking and data relay satellite system, and as a result, we won't have live video of the hatch closure, the farewells, and the hatch closure between the crew members. That is being recorded on board and will be replayed by Roman Romanenko for us to record here on the ground, and we'll be providing that video for you when we're back on the air for undocking coverage that begins at 6:15 p.m. Central Time this evening. Once again, undocking is scheduled at 6:43 p.m. Central Time, 7:43 Eastern Time. Springs on either side of the docking interface will push off against one another, and 3 minutes after physical separation, the Soyuz will execute a 15-second burn of its engines, a separation burn of about half a meter per second to begin an opening rate away from the International Space Station. The deorbit burn will ensue at 9:13 p.m. Central Time, at a point at which the Soyuz is 12 kilometers away from the International Space Station. That deorbit burn tonight will be 4 minutes, 44 seconds in duration, to slow the Soyuz down by 128 meters per second, enabling it to begin to drop out of orbit for its descent back into the Earth's atmosphere. As we await formal confirmation of the closing of the hatches, which is underway on board the International Space Station, between the crew members on either side of the docking interface, between the Soyuz spacecraft and the Poisk module, we are hearing that the Russian State Commission has given its go for landing, with all of the parameters of the Soyuz spacecraft and weather conditions ideal in the landing zone on the steppe of Kazakhstan. So the stage is set for all of the activities to unfold throughout the course of the day that will bring home Kevin Ford, Oleg Novitsky, and Yevgeny Tarelkin. We are now passing over Russian ground stations. It is expected that at this point we should receive some updates on the progress the crew is making in closing the hatches between the Soyuz TMA-06M spacecraft and the Poisk module, which is located at the space-facing port of the Zvezda service module on the Russian segment of the International Space Station. At the Russian Mission Control Center in Korolyov outside Moscow, again this view from a balcony camera overlooking the cavernous flight control room for Russian operators for the International Space Station. There is also a separate Soyuz flight control room that is also manned by a Soyuz flight director this evening, monitoring all of the Soyuz systems from this point on through the time of touchdown on the steppe of Kazakhstan. We are 3 hours, 10 minutes away from undocking, at which point Expedition 34 transitions automatically to Expedition 35. We're now receiving official word that the Soyuz has been placed on autonomous power. We are still awaiting confirmation of the hatch closing time. We still believe that the crew is working on the closing of the hatches, but the Soyuz is on an autonomous power. It's on its own internal battery power, and Soyuz Commander Oleg Novitsky is in the process of deactivating the Soyuz connection to ISS power, International Space Station power systems, which has been fed to the Soyuz since docking back on October 25th.
Are we going to autonomous power or not?
Казбек, ЦУПО Москва.
Казбек, Mission Control Moscow. Go ahead. Казбeks are here.
Казбеки, выполнен переход на питание по КРЛ.
We switched to autonomous via command radio link. You are not to perform 8.1. You don't need to.
Повторите.
Say it again.
Пункт 8.1 на странице 83 не выполняем.
8.1 on page 81. No need to perform it. We command it via KRL. Copy, no 8.1.
И вопрос.
And question.
Не забыли снять?
Did you remove the cap in КСБ-СУ?
Нет, не забыли.
Okay, we did. We did not forget it.
Все хорошо.
Very good.
Казбеки, блок очистки
Казбек.
в отсеке у вас в каком состоянии?
What is the status of the purification unit in the orbital compartment?
Сейчас уточню.
Stand by one.
Сейчас люк закроем, доложим.
We'll close the hatch and then we'll let you know.
Хорошо.
Standing by.
Хорошо.
Oleg?
This is Mission Control Houston. While we await confirmation of the closing of the hatches between the Soyuz spacecraft and the Poisk module, the Spaceflight Meteorology Group here at the Johnson Space Center looking at weather conditions on the steppe of Kazakhstan, as well as the models that have come into very good agreement over the past 24 hours, shows a forecasted landing time, which is 10:05 p.m. Central Time tonight. At the landing site to the northeast of Arkalyk, we're expecting scattered clouds at about 1,000 feet.
Moscow, Kazbek? Go ahead. Purification units are currently off, OFF. Okay, you need to turn them on. Do not forget to remove the cap from the cartridges. Copy. Oleg? Go ahead, turn on the purification units and remove the caps.
Again, the latest weather forecast being offered by the Spaceflight Meteorology Group here at the Johnson Space Center for landing conditions about 6.5 hours from now at landing time calls for a scattered deck of clouds at about 1,000 feet, a broken deck of clouds at 25,000 feet, excellent visibility, very light winds out of the southeast at about 7 miles an hour. That's insignificant. Temperatures, however, somewhat colder than previously forecast. The temperature at landing time is expected to be about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill factor of 4 degrees Fahrenheit, the landing taking place about 1 hour and 23 minutes after local sunrise. And we now have received confirmation of that the hatches are closed between the Poisk module and the Soyuz spacecraft. Hatch closure marked at 3:38 p.m. Central Time.
Oleg? Take the cap. Moscow, Kazbek? Go ahead. The cap and bow is removed. Purification units are activated. Very good, copy. Another question. What is the setting for DSD currently? Oleg?
Принято 700. Спасибо.
Copy. Inaudible. Okay. It should go here, I think.
This is Mission Control Houston. Once again, we have confirmation of the closing of the hatches between the Soyuz TMA-06M spacecraft and the Poisk module of the International Space Station that resides on the space-facing port of the Russian segment of the International Space Station. Hatch closure marked officially at 3:38 p.m. Central Time. The Soyuz has been placed on its own autonomous internal battery power, now off of International Space Station power systems, and will be for the remainder of its journey back to Earth. The next step on the road home for Kevin Ford, Oleg Novitsky, and Yevgeny Turelkin will be the depressurization of the interface vestibule or small passageway between the Soyuz and Poisk. The leak checks that will follow to ensure that we have a tight seal between the two spacecraft, and then the crew will don their Sokol launch and entry suits and strap themselves into their respective seats in the descent module of the Soyuz spacecraft, the center section of the three-section Soyuz spacecraft. Oleg Novitsky, the Soyuz commander, who will be flying under the call sign of Kazbek, will be in the center seat of the Soyuz, flanked on his left by board engineer Yevgeny Turelkin and on his right by NASA's Kevin Ford, the outgoing commander for Expedition 34, who 2 days ago handed over command of the International Space Station to Canadian Space Agency astronaut Chris Hadfield. At the time of undocking, Expedition 34 will come to a close. Expedition 35 will begin formally aboard the International Space Station as Ford, Novitsky, and Turelkin point to their undocking from the Poisk module just over 3 hours from now at 6:43 p.m. Central Time, headed for a landing at 10:05 p.m. Central Time, 36 miles to the northeast of Arkelik. Helicopters have been deployed to the forward staging points in Arkelik. 4 other Russian Mi-8 helicopters associated with the Rosaviatsia search and recovery forces, and also populated by NASA landing personnel, will be flying from Kustanay, Kazakhstan for a 2-hour flight down to the landing site. All of the helicopters will converge in a racetrack pattern around the landing zone, awaiting the arrival of the Soyuz TMA-06M, its 3 passengers, and an end to almost 5 months on orbit for Kevin Ford, Oleg Novitsky, and Yevgeny Turelkin. That'll wrap up the first of our broadcasts for today. With hatches now closed, the crew on board the Soyuz spacecraft will continue its pre-undocking preparations for undocking just under 3 hours from now. We will be back on the air at 6:15 p.m. Central Time, 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time for the undocking of Expedition 34. For now, we'll call it a broadcast. This is Mission Control, Houston.
LED D8 is no longer eliminated.